But to set that up, we're going to read a little bit more in Acts. This is not worth its own video, so I'm just going to add it on to the end of this one. We left off Paul halfway through Acts 19 when he was in Ephesus, and we read about them burning the magic books and all that, and the great work he was having. But now let's read about the opposition he faced. I don't know if this is what he was talking about when he said in 1 Corinthians 15 about fighting wild beasts. He may have been referring to this incident. This incident may have already happened by the time he wrote 1 Corinthians. I don't know. Or may yet be in the future. It's really hard to tell the timeline here based on what we have in Acts 19 and 20 and the letters to 1 Corinthians. We just don't have enough information to put the timeline together very precisely. But at any rate, I chose to leave off my reading of Acts halfway through Acts 19. And now I'm going to finish Acts 19 and read the first couple of verses of Acts 20. And that will help set the stage for the next letter, which is going to be what we call the letter of 2 Corinthians, although again, it's at least the fourth actual letter he sent to them. So, in Ephesus, not only did he have great success, as he mentioned, but he also had great opposition, as he also mentioned. And here is an example of that opposition. Acts 19, starting in verse 23, the riot in Ephesus. About that time, there arose, so at the time that Paul was doing all these things in Ephesus. Actually, you know what? Let's go back to the verse 21. After all this had happened, after Paul had all this success, and the people had turned in their magic books and scrolls and burned them, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem. Now, apparently, at the time he wrote 1 Corinthians, he hadn't yet made that decision. He was going to be sending a gift there, but he had not yet determined whether or not he was going to be going along with those men who were bringing that gift. Now he has made the decision. So 1 Corinthians would have been written before this, because he had not made that decision yet at the time of 1 Corinthians. Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. After I had been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. He sent two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he stayed on in the province of Asia a little longer. That could be representing the situation as you read about it in 1 Corinthians 15, or maybe not. It's hard to say. It really is hard to match these timelines up exactly, but it's around the same time. About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen. He called them together, along with the workmen in related trades, and said, Men, you know we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus, and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are not gods at all. Crazy talk. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. Oh, this is just intolerable. We can't let this continue. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and rushed as one man into the theater. There's a big amphitheater in Ephesus, the ruins of which are still there. So it's not as big as the Colosseum in Rome, but it's the same idea. So they're all in there, and they want action, they want bloodshed, they want vengeance. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. That would only have caused more chaos. I don't know what Paul thought he was going to do. Okay, I really honestly don't. I don't know if he thought he was going to pacify them and calm them down and teach them and preach to them. I wouldn't be surprised if he legitimately wanted to be martyred here. Like he thought, okay, this is it. Let me go. I'll go in there and they can have me. And that'll be it. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. But I don't know. It doesn't actually say. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. This is only going to make things worse, buddy. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but whatever it is, it's not going to accomplish what you think it's going to accomplish. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. You have to remember that a lot of them would have just shown up here on their way. Not all of them would have been part of the initial mob that ran there chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." A lot of them would have just seen a crowd gathering and would have just gone along. The Jews pushed Alexander to the front, and some of the crowd shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." I don't know what they wanted this Alexander guy to do. Was he going to condemn Paul? Was he going to pass it? I don't know. At any rate, he didn't do it. Whatever it was he was going to do, he didn't do it. The city clerk quieted the crowd. So eventually, after they had all shouted themselves hoarse, probably, the city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Men of Ephesus, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image which fell from heaven? Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to be quiet and not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They could press charges." He may be speaking rhetorically here, or he may be giving them some advice. I'm not sure. "If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of the day's events. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there is no reason for it." After he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and, after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. I think we'll just go ahead and stop there. I don't know how condensed that timeline is. We read earlier in Acts that he was in Ephesus for over 2 years. He was teaching in the synagogue for 3 months and then taught in somebody's school for 2 years. So he was in Ephesus for 2.5 years. I don't know when during that time that riot happened, and I don't know how long after that riot he stayed in Ephesus before he left. Was that the instigating incident that got him out? Or was he in there for, some people say he was in prison in Ephesus for a while after that riot. Maybe they did legitimately press charges against him and had him incarcerated for a period of time. I don't know. Luke does not mention that in Acts. He just kind of skips right on. My guess is that Paul, even if he was in prison, there are some people, there is a school of thought out there that Paul was in prison in Ephesus for a while, long enough, in fact, to write the prison letters from there. The prison letters that are often attributed to his time in prison in Rome, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. Some people, now most of the time you'll hear those letters attributed to his time in Rome, but some people say he wrote those while in prison in Ephesus after this riot and before he left. I am not persuaded by that. I have given that a lot of thought, and I've taken it seriously. I tend to go with the traditional view that he wrote the prison letters while in Rome later on, mainly because for him to have written the prison letters, he needed to be in prison for a while. Like, he would have had to have actually been incarcerated and unable to move or travel for some time, for a long enough period of time to have the space to write these letters. And I just don't see that being the case in Ephesus. He may have been in prison in Ephesus. That's possible. Demetrius may have legitimately pressed charges against Paul after the riot, and that may have caused Paul problems, and even caused him to become incarcerated for a period of time. That's possible, but for him to have written all 4 of those prison letters, or at least 3 of the 4, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon all go together, so they were all written at the same time. Philippians could have been presumably written at a different time, possibly, because it's different from the others. But most people put them all together in the same category. And for him to have written all 4, or at least 3 of those 4 letters at the same time, he would have had to have been in prison for a while. And I just don't think that for him to have been in prison long enough to have time to write those letters, I think that would have been mentioned in Acts if he'd been in prison in Ephesus for such a long period of time. Now, there are things that happened to him that Acts does not mention. Paul lists a whole lot of things that he had experienced at the end of 2 Corinthians, or the next that we're going to read. He lists a whole bunch of things that have happened to him, some of which we read about in Acts, and some of which we don't. So things did happen to him that Acts does not include or record. But for him to have written the letter, and he'd been in prison, he suffered beatings that are not recorded in Acts, but for him to have been in prison long enough to write those prison letters, he would have had to have been there for a pretty substantial amount of time. A pretty good chunk of those 2 years he spent in Ephesus after getting kicked out of the synagogue would have had to have been in prison. A pretty good chunk. And I don't see Luke going to the trouble of writing all this down, even giving us a length of time in which Paul was in Ephesus, and not mentioning it if he'd been in prison for that period of time. That just seems implausible to me. So I think the conventional view is correct, and he wrote those letters while he was in Rome, and his next letter is 2 Corinthians, which we will read next time. We will read the letter to 2 Corinthians next, and we will save the prison letters after Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians to his time in Acts in prison in Rome, which I think is when those were actually written.